Welcome to Independent Thought and Freedom. Although the mainstream English language media is not covering it adequately, France is undergoing a remarkable, deep turmoil. The middle and working classes are in a several months-long revolt known as the Gilet Jaunes movement, named after the yellow vests which French motorists are required to have in their vehicles by law. Since November, hundreds of thousands have protested, usually on weekends, against the rising fuel prices, the high cost of living, the disproportionate burden of the government taxes reforms falling on the working and middle classes, especially in the rural and peri-urban areas. The protesters have called for lower fuel taxes, a reintroduction of the solidarity tax on wealth, a minimum wage increase, the implementation of citizens' initiative referendums, and the resignations of Emmanuel Macron, President of France, and his government. The protests have involved demonstrations and the blocking of roads and fuel depots. Some of the protests have developed into major riots, described as the most violent since those of May 1968. And the police response has resulted in many cases in loss of limbs and eyes. It's brutal. This movement has gained international attention, and protesters in many places around the world, some with similar grievances, others unrelated, have used the yellow vest as a symbol. On May Day, 300 protesters were arrested, it's been reported, as they clashed with police in Sweden, Denmark, Germany, France, Italy, Russia, and elsewhere. Arrests were made as demonstrations became violent on that day as well. What does this whole movement mean for the state of France, of Europe? And how does this relate to the political upheavals taking place all over the world? Today, I am pleased to have as my guest three-time French presidential candidate Jacques Cheminade, President of the French party Solidarité et Progrès. Welcome, Monsieur Cheminade.
Thank you very much for this invitation, and I hope to, let's say a few words that will make the oligarchy unhappy.
I think so. I've been trying to get someone close to the Gilet Jaunes movement in France on my podcast for months now, and I've not been successful. So I am very anxious to talk to you because ever since it started, I recognized it as a key moment, and it's amazing that it's so underreported. Don't you think so in the English-speaking media?
Well, it's a groundswell, and it's something happening not only in France, but in the United States, and as you said before, in Europe, and in many, many countries, even beyond the United States and Europe.
Yeah.
What it means is that people want dignity, they want to be respected, and it's not only a question of living standards, it's a question of participating to their own destiny, not to be excluded, to be part of the decisions taken for which would have an effect on them. They want, this is called participative democracy as opposed to representative democracy. And they want both, in fact. And this participative democracy is the famous referendum d'initiative citoyenne, citizens' initiative referendum, which is something that we're fighting to connect to something which for us is absolutely the key to the present moment of history, which is who controls the tap money, who controls the issuance of money.
Right.
And the issuance of money controls power. So we want a referendum of this sort, a people's initiative referendum, a citizens' initiative referendum, based on the demand for a national bank. A national bank that would create the conditions, a national bank for the people, by the people, and controlled by the people, where the people would have seats in the direction of the bank, not like today, where people sitting on the direction of banks issuing money, it's no more the national banks, it's all the banks that are issuing money in this deregulated international system. So the issuance of money is for fewer and fewer people, an oligarchy who owns more and more of all areas of the economy, and the people are more and more excluded. It's in France, not yet like in a third world country or even in the United States. There are still social measures taken, which comes from the Council National of the Resistance from 1945. But it's more and more difficult for people from, let's say, middle class or working class backgrounds to have access to what is due to them, and to have access in particular to culture and to positions of power.
I want to ask you something about this. The position of the National Bank, is that something that the Gilet Jaunes have been calling for explicitly, or is this something that you are seeing as what is needed to address the concerns of the Gilet Jaunes?
Well, most of our members are Gilet Jaunes at this point.
Right.
They went with them, they're out in the streets with them, and they're in the discussions, all the discussions with them. It's very interesting because over the months, and it started in November, now it's December, January, February, March, April, is almost 5 months. There is an educational process. This is the press doesn't cover it. And the educational process is to discuss from where the injustice is coming from. What is this injustice which is more and more felt, and what it means? So we are in discussions with them, saying that the issue of participative democracy is obviously key, but it has to be connected to the reality of the world where we are, which means a banking separation, the famous Glass-Steagall from Roosevelt, a national bank, and what Jean Jaurès, the French socialist of the beginning of the 20th century, called public national democratic credit, which means it's credit issued not to feed the markets, the financial markets, but credit issued to develop the future of the society, and not only for the common good of the existing human beings, but of future generations.
I want to dwell on this banking issue a little more. I know that you know, the Gilets Jaunes have been talking about the rising cost of living, and they don't see a future. And people, working people and middle class people throughout the industrialized world are feeling that right now. And you know, it goes so much against the dominant narrative of progress by liberal media and education. You know, they say, you know, we're so much better because, I don't know, we have iPhones or the internet. I mean, the internet is great, iPhones are great, fine. But what people don't realize is that I mean, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, a man with who had a high school education could have a job in a factory and raise a wife, a family, a children, have a house, and that's impossible today. I mean, and that is, yes, that's not poverty.
If you look at the figures today, to buy a car or to buy a decent house or a decent apartment, you need 2 times more working hours than in the 1960s. And that's a real problem. So people, they can't make it. So how is it that there were no more revolt or insurrection from the people? It's because the governments and the central banks, who own the governments at this point, have issued credit to the people to replace wages or income. So people are being caught in the debt trap.
Right.
Said in the world that the Chinese are getting in the debt trap, the countries of the third world, the poor countries, and so on and so forth. In fact, it's in the West where this is happening with all the people. People have debts to pay, and they were paralyzed by the ideas to have to pay these debts. Now, with the Gilet Jaunes, with the yellow vest, this has been completely changed. And I think France has something different than other countries. We are celebrating now the 50th anniversary of the referendum that de Gaulle lost in April 1969. It was on participation. Now this issue of participation with a participative democracy is again on the table. And this is very, very important. At the same time, you have Europe that means now about nothing for people. People think that this Europe has failed. It has been a Europe controlled by the international financial markets through the euro. And Europe, instead of fighting for the future or bringing a future to the people, has been stifling, in fact, the economy and the purchasing power of the people, reducing the purchasing power of people, the real purchasing power. And this creates really, because of de Gaulle's policy in the past, because of this issue of participation in the population, a kind of remembrance of something that could have been. That's one point. The other point is that they see what's happening in the world, they see all the changes, and they say, oh, this is good and fair, but it doesn't go in the right direction. The people have to be on top of the definition of the policy, and it should be a policy for the people and by the people. But they say you have to tackle the real issue, and the real issue is this money. The money issued should go for infrastructure and for long-term investments, and also to increase the purchasing power of the people and the qualification of the people, and the public health, of course. And where they see this sense of optimism, they see it in China. In China, about 47% of the people think that things are going to be better in the future. In France, 3%.
That's correct. Yeah, the sense of optimism you see in China and in Asia in general, totally different from the West. The West is sort of on a cultural nihilism, and that's I know something that you've talked about for a long time. Not just only in this Gilet Jaunes movement, and so we can discuss that. But before we get to that, you mentioned about the Europe and the revolt against I think it's the EU. That's what I want to ask. In fact, is there? I mean, of course, we know in Britain there's the anti-EU sentiment. We know that there's that to some extent in the southern European countries, and Italy and Greece, and the people of Greece were betrayed when Syriza did not follow through their mandate. But in this in France, it's seen as the center of the European Union project, and France and Germany. But is there a strong anti-EU sentiment there? That's part of this whole framework?
People are afraid to leave the euro and the EU, but they don't like it. So they have to be given a sense of the future. What they find us should be a project for the future, and more than a project, the principles for a future. The anti-European Union people here in diverse political parties say we are going to leave and things are going to be better. In fact, it's not so easy. We need a project for the future, and we need a long-term project. It's there that the works and the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche, his wise words, as Jesus Lopez Portillo, the Mexican leader, said one day, this is what should bring a direction to what's happening. You have, for example, in Italy, you have things that are really very unstable. On one side, you have this policy for Glass-Steagall, which is very interesting. Our candidate, Marco Zanni, I think that Liliana told you about that.
Yes.
For Glass-Steagall. And also, there is this memorandum of understanding with China. So there is a change. But at the same time, there is this anti-immigrant motion, this movement, which raises doubts about foreign people. So what we have to do is to create a sense of a community of development in the countries of the South and in our own countries, and create employment in both sides. And then there is a solution to the problem.
Can I ask you about the MOU?
Sorry?
could I ask you about the MOU
sure,
with China? France, I know President Macron did visit China, and it seemed to go very well, and nice speeches and everything. But it seems that they're very much that Macron is very much against Italy joining and also signing MOUs. Could you explain that?
Yes, it's very simple. Macron is fully committed to defend the European Union as it is, or he wants to change it, but it's words, words, and words. He gives very beautiful speeches formally, but there is no reality, no substance behind them. And that's a big problem with Macron. He has been trained in the highest French institutions, so he knows how to speak. But now the way he speaks appears for the Gilet Jaunes something fake, because his nice words don't correspond to any reality, and the way he says things is formal, is literary, is not real. So the Gilets Jaunes are bringing something else into it's a new sense of the language, more direct, no court manners.
Let's go back to his election then, because you participated in that election as well in the first round, and I mean the whole all the frenzy that we were seeing from the outside was that everyone was so scared that Le Pen would be elected, and oh no, she made the second round, and so everybody just went behind Macron, which I knew was going to be a disaster.
It's very simple. They pushed Marine Le Pen to allow Macron to be president, because everybody got afraid by Marine Le Pen of what she was saying, so they voted for Macron. I refused to vote for the one or for the other in the second round. I said, Marine Le Pen has no future and no program, and Macron is a disaster because he's brought to power with financial forces. So we need something else. And now it's what the Gilets Jaunes are understanding. And this may take the form of people of different political affiliations coming together, even people from the extreme right wing, from the extreme left, and even certain people from the Macron. Everything is in turmoil, everything is in a state of change. That's a very interesting thing. And people look at what happened in the United States with Trump, what happened in England with the Brexit. I should stress a point here on the Brexit, because on the one side, you had those who wanted to remain in Europe and the European Union as it is. Those who wanted to leave, a lot of them were for very good reasons. But on top of them, somebody like Nigel Farage, who is now working for Steve Bannon, Nigel Farage wanted to reestablish the British empire, but this time not territorial, but based on the City of London and the fiscal tax havens. Mm-hmm. And it's a very interesting book by Nicholas Jackson, which describes very well what Lyndon LaRouche first put on the table, which is the rule of the British Empire. British mind, American muscle. And Jackson describes very well how this British Empire shifted from a territorial geographic empire to a financial and secret services empire. And that's what it is today, and it has contaminated the United States. Mm-hmm. Trump...
Even during imperialism itself, Nehru noted in his biography and his outline of world history, how the British Empire from the beginning was a financial empire. In fact, before the British government went into India, it was the East India Company. It wasn't even the government. It's not the government.
It's a private council of the Queen.
That's right.
The City of London with a remembrancer. In England, when there is a debate in the Parliament, a person representing the City of London is next to the people making the laws.
That's correct.
Said, the city objects, and then it stopped.
Yes.
So you have that in England. It's very clear. It's under control. It's a fake democracy.
Yes. That's right. I'd like to bring this in. You mentioned the larger world experience, and you yourself were born in Argentina, and I would imagine that your Argentinian experience has made you very sensitive to the issues of underdevelopment, to the issues of financial exploitation, because Argentina has gone through a lot of that in its struggles with the IMF, in its debt defaults and these sorts of things that it keeps struggling with after being such a prosperous country in the first half of the 20th century, then economic turmoil. I'm sure that informs your vision. Am I correct?
Yes, because it's absolutely ridiculous and unjust to say the Argentinians were sitting on immense wealth, on tremendous wealth, and they are not serious, they can't manage it. It's not true. What was sitting on the Argentinians and prevented them to becoming a nation state, which would have been an example for South America, for Latin America, is first Spanish imperialism, then British imperialism, and then Anglo-American imperialism. So all these fought on the back of Argentina, and there are people who fought against it. I was born under Peronismo. So Peronismo had a good impulse, but at the same time, they made compromises with all kinds of political forces, and it was difficult at the time to be different, but there was this sense of compromise. And at the same time, there was encouraged from outside and from inside after a certain point, corruption and insecurity. So people in Brazil, for example, voted for Bolsonaro because they fear corruption, and they don't like corruption, and they fear insecurity. And they were absolutely, let's say, absolutely out of understanding of what's happening to their own country. And this American or Anglo-American fake counterculture has infected the minds of people. I often said in France, the grounds of the battle is in the spirit, is in our own spirits, it's inside our minds, because it's there that we have to fight for a world which will be a win-win world, a world which has a future defined by a community of development. So this, in a certain sense, the Chinese understand in their own way. It's not perfect, but they understand it. And what they put on the table with the new Silk Roads is something connected to their own history and even the history of the West. Yeah. If you look at the history, you saw that in the 11th, 12th, 13th century, there was, in France in particular, a really industrial and agricultural revolution, a tremendous development associated to the cathedrals.
Yes, yes, I think a lot of people, I'm glad you raised that, although it's an obscure historical point, but the Middle Ages have a bad name. They have a bad name.
And what's happening in China at the same time? Yeah. There was an industrial revolution under the Songs. So there were these two industrial revolutions, and we have to be much more serious and look what connected them. For example, windmills or water mills or even iron mills were all created or imagined or, let's say, conceived in China. Right. And it came to Europe. How? I don't know. So, but it's very interesting to have to check into all that. We had a debate in our cadre school in the...
I mean, and that since you brought up the cathedrals, obviously the destruction of Notre Dame. How do you how did you feel about that? How, does that have any? What significance does that have in France's moment right now? How do you see that? Is it apocryphal?
I am like Lyndon LaRouche was a real follower of Leibniz, and he said, from an evil could always come a better good. Mm-hmm. So there was this sense of the need for something else when Notre Dame burns. This was not an accident, may have been an accident in itself, but for the people, it was a sense that things that exist, that are a thing of joy for humanity, these things can be destroyed, which means that new things have to be built to keep the best from the past and to create something in the future, to be defined by the future. And suddenly people realize that the rebuilding of Notre Dame should be, in a sense, this is what I said and insisted on it, should be connected to the rebuilding of Europe.
Yeah.
Europe doesn't need the European Union, doesn't need the Euro, doesn't need NATO. What we need is the European civilization of the cathedrals connected to a development of human beings, and for each of them, the right to be intervening in their own business. It was clear even in the Middle Ages, so-called,
Yes.
The serfdom was disappearing at the time of the cathedrals. I was in Autun, one of the cathedrals, and they showed me something saying it proved that there was anti-Semitism. It was not anti-Semitism at all. What it was a sense of history connected to,
right,
let's say, these two religions who defined some good in world history. There is this famous Mill of Moses in Vézelay or in other French cathedrals, which is with the wheat, you do something better. The wheat comes from the Ancient Testament.
That's right.
There's a New Testament. So this image is very interesting today because we have to do something even better in the future, inspired by these things from the past.
I think it's very important that you mentioned the anti-Semitism remark, because I think that particular criticism is used as in a very Orwellian way, and they use it to stifle dissent. So when people start to talk about international banking, they automatically say it's anti-Semitic. So you can't speak about it anymore. If you know, because it is just a fact, and you can explain it however you want, but it is a fact that there are many Jews who are at the head, Lehman Brothers and all these things. So we can deny this, we can avoid it. We don't have to speak about it if you don't want to, but the issue remains. And even in the Middle Ages, it's tying into some of my other talks and some controversial aspects, but during the Middle Ages, usury was not part of the financial system. And these cathedral buildings and so many of the great building projects of the Middle Ages were financed in a way that sort of has been lost. Now we can only think of these sort of usurious financing systems, which ends up enriching the lenders as opposed to enriching the community. And I'm very interested in the systems of credit, that you're talking about, because people don't understand how the financial system really is at so much at the root of our contemporary oppression in the world, whether it be in the industrial world or the third world.
And much more than the financial system, which is a shadow on the wall of the cave, as Plato would say, the conception of man. It's man seen as a person defined by its possessions, not property, possessions. Yes. And he wants to possess more and more. So this is something that has been infecting all the human history, this sense of possession, and man as something that wants to have the illusion to be immortal through his power. Yes. So the opposite is what Larouche always fought for, is to be immortal through one's deeds. Yes. And this was associated in the Middle Ages. You have, for example, in France, a great rabbi in the city of Troyes, Rachi, who was part of this reflection going on in the whole country about the better government. And these things of the better government associated people from various religions. And this better government is committed to something that it's not financial forces based on looting and, after some point, destruction, but based on what we can build together, the community of development. And it's very interesting in certain speeches of Xi Jinping that he's bringing that issue. I'm not saying that Xi Jinping is perfect, but I'm saying he's the only one, the only head of state, which brings this. And he says that in 50 years, or not in 50 years, but for the anniversary of the Chinese Revolution in 2050, there should be, he says, a China defined by connectivity, increasing the purchasing power, and, he says, democracy and beauty. So it's the first time that I see a head of state mentioning this beauty. Yes. And you have a big fight in France because a lot of people are encouraged to be against the Chinese, and you see a kind of racism that it's against the Chinese, against the Muslims, against the Jews, and this should be eliminated forever. It should be we should think in terms of human beings, and all of them bringing with their own culture, the best of their own cultures, defining a future for the world. This is our conception of a new Bretton Woods. So
I'll tell you that as someone who is not of European descent, I mean, I'm of Indian descent, I'm from the Caribbean. But I don't. I sort of understand a lot of ordinary white working class feelings in America and Europe about the immigrants and so forth in a lot of it, because I think it's the way that mass immigration has been done, and it's been tied to deindustrialization. It's been tied to loss of control of the economy. It's been tied to just a loss of control over one's life in general, and over one's nations, and that they see this sort of as a symbol of strangeness that they didn't invite. And of course, I mean, there's no way I would condone the violence and the bullying and all that sort of stuff, but I don't think that it comes from a place because they're evil or because they're just bad people. I don't think it comes from that at all. There is, they may not know how to react to it. They may not understand why these things have happened, but they are right to feel that there is a threat to the order that they felt before. And I think a lot of times, the whole immigrants and immigration issue, it's sort of used as kind of human shields or human fodder, because a lot of these elites that are bringing them in, they live in the whitest communities with the gated with the gates and fence all around them, and they tell the working class, you all can deal with the disorder, just don't bring it in my neighborhood. And the working classes see that, and they see the hypocrisy, and it's and then from my point of view, from someone from a developing country, I personally don't like it when our people go and migrate, and they think that the best thing to do is to leave our countries and go up there like up there some sort of land of milk and honey, when they're going to be experiencing hell up there as well, and that we have a responsibility to develop our own countries. So I just wanted to put that in there, because I think that those things become easy criticisms of what's going on up there. Yeah.
In fact, the big surprise of the media or the established people in the establishment is that immigration is not the issue among the Yellow Vests.
That's right.
They may think that it's a danger because there is competition for their jobs, but they know that this is not created by the immigrants, it's created by the people who organized the financial and economic system in a way that there is competition for the jobs.
Absolutely.
So they have an understanding of that. And I must add something, is that the French national, how you say?
En français?
C'est la devise, the French national
spirit. Okay. Yes.
That is the basis for our constitution.
Right. Yes.
It's freedom, liberté, égalité, equality, and fraternity.
That's right.
And fraternity is very important, and it's very interesting that a few people that helped people flying away from the countries and entering into France, and who helped them. They did not help them to cross the French border, but they helped them when they were in France. And they were condemned by a tribunal for helping, for what they called a délit de solidarité. They were accused to have been in solidarity against the law. So right. The Constitutional Council has rejected that, and they said that the way you treat foreigners should be defined by a principle of the French Constitution, which is fraternity. So this is not new, but it has received a kind of let's say judiciary approval. So it's
and from the Caribbean, I want to interject here that the Haitian Revolution was part of the French Revolution, and when liberté, égalité, fraternité was declared, that's when that's when Toussaint Louverture switched sides from the Spanish to the French, and fought for the liberation of the states, which was under the French government at the time. Toussaint Louverture did not rebel against the French government. That was part of the revolutionary government. It was later Napoleon that reintroduced the slavery, and Toussaint had to fight him. But the spirit of the French Revolution was also, they freed the slaves. That was the initial declaration.
And it's Napoleon, as the head of an empire, not yet an empire at the time, but it was a consulate, he sent there his brother-in-law, the brother of Josephine, to massacre the Haitians and to reestablish slavery. Yeah. So it's the empire. And the big problem in France, the big issue in politics, and people are not always conscious of it, is a fight between the Republic and the principles of the Republic and the principles of the empire. Yeah. And the Republic, the empire, with a British way of divide to rule, manipulating things, the empire has frontally attacked the Republic, but also has made all efforts to inject into the Republic what would self-destroy it. Yeah. So it's a very interesting issue to understand also in colonial countries that have been colonized.
There's one other thing about, to bring it back up to the present, about Gilet Jaunes. There's one other aspect. So we have the sort of race thing, but the idea, the climate change thing, because in a sense, you could probably interpret the Gilet Jaunes movement as a revolt against this climate change, global warming hoax, as I would have to call it.
Not really.
No?
They have doubts about everything that the present ruling powers and principalities say. So they have doubts about that. But immigration and climate change were not the issues. The issue was we need justice. We can't continue living in a world where money is going more and more into the pockets of 5 or even 3% of the population and not in ours. Yeah. So let's look at this issue of the climate as not what will define everything. In that sense, you are right. It's not what should define everything. What should define everything is our future and how we're going to define our future. And when they say that we are guilty of the climate change because we are running in our cars, or we go to the jobs in our cars, this is a laughable stock. We don't accept that. Yeah. That's true. What they say is that this climate change is something that it's developing as disconnected from the issue of who is looting the world. Who is looting the world are these financial forces. With the climate change issue, they try to culpabilize everybody for this issue. And at the same time, you look at the political parties that are financed by, let's say, financial interests, who hypocritically say that the big problem of the future is climate change and so on and so forth. So you have in the United States, Amalia Osorio-Cortez or others who are calling for this Green New Deal. And it's ridiculous because you cannot base a policy of the future on the fact that the human being would be defined by as a looter by definition. This is crazy because the human being is part of the ecology, is part of the environment, is part of nature, and he has to make a leading role and he has to be responsible about that. But not,
I am very much
universe. It's crazy to oppose nature and man is crazy.
That's right, exactly.
Of humanism has brought the two together.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's a policy of depopulation. It's a really anti-human. It's both anti-human and anti-science. And they like to say they are pro-science, but I mean, one of the things Karl Popper always said, and I mean, he didn't invent science, obviously, but his formulation, I think, is very good when he talked about the falsifiable hypothesis. that, to have a really scientific frame of mind, you need to be able to frame questions so that they can be falsifiable. But with climate change, with global warming, so every time there's something to contradict it, they just change around the theory to accommodate it, and so there's no way that you can ever prove it wrong. It's a religion. It's a dogma.
It becomes a dogma.
Theology.
Yes, exactly.
And it is nihilism. It's almost
it's a blackmail.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a doomsday cult, and it's like they almost have a perverse pleasure in saying that the world is going to end in 10 years or 12 years. You can
which in turn doesn't mean that all the owners of the big firms of, let's say, Esso, Total in France, or all these firms are good people. No. But it means that they themselves encourage this thing to avoid a true social revolt.
Yes. Oh, of course. And all these firms, Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron, and whatever, all these oil firms, BP. Now, I find that this whole hijacking of the environmentalist movement with this global, because nobody talks about pollution anymore. They don't talk about oil spills. They don't talk about the air quality, air pollution, acid. That used to define the environmental movement, and that is environmentalism. You want clean air, clean water. They keep talking about this doomsday scenario 10 years from now all the time. It's like all the big polluters have got let off. Nobody talks about the pollution of rivers, water supply, the toxic chemicals in the air, or our food.
It's a way to destroy the sense of hope in people, and to bring in their minds the issue of their self-destruction. And this was very clear in all kind of things happening in this world, with the increase in suicides, for example. We have an increase of suicides in the French farmers, in the French police, in the whole population, because the conditions of life are not what they should be. And the conditions of the future, people don't believe anymore that their sons and daughters, and their great sons and great daughters, would have a better life than them. They believe that the future is going to be let's say, bad future.
Yeah, worse for their children. People don't believe that
you have to reestablish the rules of science, which proves that the human being masters the laws of the universe. It can do better for himself and for his environment. And Lyndon LaRouche, all his life, has been committed to rehabilitate science, the true science, which is the expression of the creative powers of the human beings.
Yeah.
And these creative powers of the human beings are something which is civilizational. It changes the relation between man and nature, and human history has been constantly a product of this capacity to change. And if this is not reestablished, today we are going into a financial chaos and war, because at the point when people fight for the financial power and they don't produce with the money or with credit issue, they don't produce the goods for the future, they would fight to keep their part of the cake. And this is what's happening in the world today. So the different way to think is to produce more for all. And this would solve all these problems: environment, immigration, all these things. And when you say that, you are said, oh, you are naive, or you think, or you should not explain these things. In my presidential campaigns, everything was done to prevent me to explain these things.
Yeah.
They tried to corner, in all debates, to corner me in small issues. So when you try to uplift the level of discussion, immediately it becomes this talks, this
that's right.
talks.
Are you aware of someone named, an American inventor and philosopher named Buckminster Fuller as well? Are you aware of him?
His name.
Sorry?
I know his name, and he's.
Yes, yeah. I find he's very similar to Lyndon LaRouche in a lot of ways. And I actually knew about him before LaRouche. And the way he thought about this, I've always loved it. And he said that human beings are the agents, are the universe's agents, so that the universe can become self-aware, right? And that the earth has everything we need in terms of energy, food, resources, and that is, it is us as sort of the key agents of the universe to unlock all of this, unlock this abundance, and that I mean, what LaRouche brings, he articulates it in his own way, and then he also talks about the countervailing oligarchical view about scarcity, and their view that there's only a finite amount of resources, it's a zero-sum game, and that therefore you need war, oppression, imperialism, all this. It is a move, it is an opposite view from the view that the universe really has everything we need, and it is the human mind that has to unlock it.
What at the beginning changed my life is when LaRouche said, look, in the world, this was in the 1970s, at the beginning of the 1970s of past century, he said, you have on one side all these financial powers that are rising and who are looting the world and creating more and more a world where the capacity of development of each human beings would be prevented. So if you attack that, if you attack the International Monetary Fund, if you attack these international megabanks, at the time you were left or extreme left. But he said at the same time, you have a culture of destruction, which he called at the time the sex, rock, drug counterculture. This counterculture is also based on the short term. So you have the short term on one side with the financial forces and the short term with the culture. And this creates a world with no future. What we have to always think is to think of the world in terms of what is going to happen in the future, looking into those in the past who themselves created the capacity for us to be here because they thought themselves from the future, not to pick up their solutions as such, but to pick up their impulse and the method by which they reach their solutions. So he organized classes for his second youth movement, the first youth movement in the 1960s, the more recent youth movement.
At that time, you were based in the United States?
I was in the United States because I was French commercial attaché and then counselor in New York. So I was looking at something.
Were you a civil servant or were you a political appointee?
I was from this School of Public Administration, École Nationale d'Administration. So what I had, coming from Argentina, very soon I had seen how the European elites were losing contact with morality and reality.
Yeah.
So I was looking for something different. So I went in many directions to find something different. In many political parties, none responded to what I thought. And then in the United States, I heard LaRouche for the first time. So what impressed me is that he showed the general direction for the world was going, because he knows where the world had to go. So he was not saying that as in terms of punishment for what was happening, but as a way to explain how what could be good was destroyed by people who were not doing the good. For me, evil only comes when people don't do good. And
you know what I find interesting, and I'd like to hear from your perspective. I mean, the way the LaRouche movement sort of, was initially characterized, well, it initially was on the left. LaRouche was considered a Marxist theorist, and he wrote about Marxism for a while. And labor
Marxism.
Sorry?
In his first book, Dialectic Economics, he was an explorator of Marxism. Right. And people who were the dogmatic Marxists hated him because he was exploring.
Because you were kind of like an independent-minded Marxist, not a Soviet or Leninist as such. Marxist,
because he always was inspired by Leibniz and the works of Leibniz.
Right. And then later on, he was, branded sometimes even fascist or far right. You have all these
anything and its contrary.
Yes, exactly. But certainly, I myself too, started out on the left, and to me, those labels, I abandoned those labels a long time ago because it makes no sense, the left and right and what it's, and it's I think in this Gilet Jaunes movement, we're seeing that too, all around the world. We're seeing all these movements and parties.
People who are moderate, people who are extreme left, people who are extreme right, and they discuss what they discovered. And it's very funny because it was turning the weapons of the enemy against them, against him. It was Facebook and Google Maps. And suddenly, talking to each other through that, they saw that they were not the only ones suffering from certain things, that people, their neighbors, having the same problem. And then all of a sudden, with an impulsion around this Gilet Jaunes movement, they decided to go out and speak to each other. So that's extremely interesting because it's what, in her own way, Rosa Luxemburg called a mass strike ferment. Not a mass strike, a ferment. You don't know where it goes, you don't know how it will evolve, but it's based on something which is just and fair.
Yeah.
And I wrote something in 2009 saying it was to the coming anger. And I knew that at some point this would happen. I did not know when, nobody can predict, but I knew that something would happen. It has happened. Now it depends from us to help to give them a direction towards the truth and towards a sense that they have to fight for the development in all aspects of public life of the creative powers of the human being. And this
can we go back to your involvement with the LaRouche movement? I think it's interesting. So you were a public servant.
Yes.
And so you started to go to the LaRouche classes, is that it?
Yes, I saw him for the first time. I did not agree with everything he was saying, but I said he's saying what he says from a different way.
Yeah.
And his principles, this I like.
Mm-hmm. And was that? Did you have to do that in secret? I mean, was that against the terms of your?
I must say that at the time, the French administration, the French security services looked at me with a bad eye. But when I came back to France, I was reestablishing all my rights in the French administration. So there was in those days a direction in the French administration towards, let's say, sovereignty of the human minds and sovereignty of the nation. This is what's being lost today.
Because, I mean, you left, obviously, and you entered into the political fray. Sorry?
I remained in the administration from 1974, when I first met LaRouche, to 1981. And then in 91, I left.
In
people
81?
think I was crazy. Think people in the administration, all these people in the upper civil service, thought I was crazy because I lost the protection of the civil service and I was not going with a person which was supposed to be in the establishment, was a person who was the enemy of the establishment. And this was supposed to be crazy. Most of the people that I knew in those days saw that I was going crazy.
Yeah. Well, what was it that made you make that move? Did you go to start a party? Did you go to join the Schiller Institute? What was?
I know that something was true, that people were discussing about the reality of what's happening, and they tried to build an alternative, an alternative project. And I saw them working, I worked with them, and I thought that this was the right direction, and this has to, in a positive way, to contaminate the environment of thinking in the West, and also in the East. And at the same time, I decided to change my life, and I knew it. And I knew that it was not really changing, because it was going in a direction of what I had been thinking of doing with my life, but I had not found the opportunity to do it.
And if you don't mind me ask, how old are you at the time?
33.
33.
So I was the age of Christ.
Yeah.
I was old. All the people in the LaRouche movement were saying, they were young people, what is this old guy doing there? He's in the administration, he may be an agent, he may be this and that. So they were very surprised to see a mind changing.
Yes, because you weren't a student radical or whatever. You were part of the French civil service. I mean, you come from a different background than I suppose a lot of the others. Is that correct?
Yes, in a sense, it was a different country. A lot of Americans at the time thought that France was still a country with farmers and cows. And they did not understand that the development of nuclear energy in France, the development of the nation, which was a period of extremely active development of the French society. And May 68 tried to prevent it because they tried to distort a sense of justice. There was a demand for justice behind the 68ers, but it was distorted into on one side, a political dogma of sorts, and more than anything else, the regulation of principles. So the regulation of principles started in the way you were living, and then the regulation went into the financial system to allow the proverbial fox to be free among the chicken. And
let me stay on this point for a little while. I think it's interesting because May 1968 is seen by the establishment now as such an important, pivotal cultural turning point, as a point of freedom and liberation, and that the student movement that started in France in May 68 sort of started movements all over the world, including in America. Although you had the civil rights movement going on from the 50s, Paris, May 68, I suppose, was bringing in the white students involved in the sort of decolonization and civil rights struggle that were going on in the 50s, and so it kind of brought in America the yippies and I suppose SDS and all these sorts of things, but they see it as a great and laudable thing that happened.
Well, for them,
yeah, that's right. Now you
a great thing because it created a move out of politics of these youth and into the consumption society,
right,
and into a spirit, what LaRouche said.
So in 68, were you a student?
In 68, I was at the School of Public Administration. It was very funny to see it from inside. There was such a volatility, a change inside the school that in our, in our year of studies.
Your cohort, yeah.
Promotion, we refused to be taken a picture. So there are all these pictures of all, and all of a sudden a hole, and then
right.
So we did not know where we were going, but we were against something that we were, let's say, smelling, which was bad.
Right.
And so I in particular, others maybe less, but I in particular, because of my past experience and the experience of what becomes at a certain point fake, how Peronism became fake in Argentina,
yes,
how the opponents of Peron were even worse fakes, and all this sense of fakeness is very funny. It brings to our moment in history where it appears openly that the society is based on that, and something truthful has to be brought in this society. And it's there that the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche is so important.
But I'm just very the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche is extremely important, and we will get to that for sure. But when you were you were the age in 1968 of many of the protesters.
I was 26 and a half.
Right, so that's prime age, and so many of your friends would I suppose would have been your friends and colleagues would have been part of the protest. So you didn't participate in anything?
Yes, we were a part of a protest. We wanted to change the School of Public Administration, and some of us were going in the streets. But I saw very soon that to burn cars, to create disorder, was a kind of provocation. And if you look at it historically, you see a coherence between the provocations in May 68 and what de Gaulle was doing against the Anglo-American financial system. Because at the beginning of 68, France was the only country who continued to transform dollars into gold. They had a right to do so. All the other countries submitted to this system. And it was called American system. It wasn't. It was an Anglo-American system. It has to be understood like that. It was not the system of the American people. It was the Anglo-American system.
That's right.
And then France, de Gaulle being opposed to that, he tried to get support from...
Yes, because, you know, that's an important point you make, the Anglo-American system, because it was really set up by Keynes, right? Although it's in Bretton Woods, but I mean, Lord Keynes was the brains behind it. That's right.
And also, in the British oligarchy, all those who wanted to impose not only free trade, but much worse, financial deregulation, what they called liberalization of finances. So Churchill, in a speech very early, in 1947, said that that should be imposed on Europe. And right from the beginning, the European Union, or the Common Market, was in part a commitment of a common development. But at the same time, it was a, let's say, an orientation towards a financial liberal system, which is now converted into a financial dictature, because this is not liberalism, it's a dictature.
That's right. Because this is interesting. I never made that connection in the way you're making it. Yes, de Gaulle was, yes, converting dollars into gold. And this is ultimately why Nixon delinked the dollar from gold in 72, because they just could, the system, they printed too many dollars and they did not have enough gold if all the countries were going to make the claim. So, and I never linked May 68 to that. That's a very, very interesting
Another thing, the slogan, political slogan of the 68ers, I don't know if they invented the slogan themselves or it was, let's say, inspired by different agencies, were saying 2 years, 10 years is too much against de Gaulle. And they promoted the cult of the youth. De Gaulle is old, he should be rejected, and it's the youth and the youth and the...
Yes.
What a guy said, à la guerre des classes, the war of classes, of social classes, has been substituted the wars of the ages.
Yes, of the generations, yes.
Generation. So this has been played upon to change the society in the direction of, let's say, that the fulfillment of desires should be imposed against the fight for a future.
Right. The short term over the long term.
Once called our commitment to short-termism, instead of have a long-term vision. So at this point, even in France, a few people told me that I can't be a political leader because I have a long-term vision, and this is not good for political leaders.
But
the population likes it, starts to like it.
Yeah. Just a final point on the May 68, because it is relevant to today very much, because people are making a lot of links. But so your sort of suspicion and your apprehension with what was going on at the time in 68, would you say at the time you saw yourself as being critical of it from a left-wing perspective or from a conservative perspective or anything like that?
As a good thing turned into a bad thing from inside.
Right.
And I said I should check how it was possible. And this is a bit of culture, because there was not a culture of creation, a culture of the creative powers of human beings. It was a culture of satisfying the individual desires of diverse persons and to be in a position in society, and the youth against the old ones. A perspective of power per se and not a perspective of power to achieve something for the future generations.
Right, right. And so now, I mean, and so it makes a lot of sense that when you went to America and you heard Lyndon LaRouche saying almost the same things that you would have been feeling in May 68 about his critique of...
It started before in America. It started against what Martin Luther King represented, and he was murdered for that because he could represent something different. And he was putting together all the different components of the American population in sense of unity. After it was a segmentation. And if you look at this segmentation, who started there, today it reaches an incredible point because thanks to the new technologies, you can give to people what they expect to be given to them.
Yes.
So you create groups, separated the ones against the others, and if you segment the population, you keep your power by dividing to rule, the British Empire, divide to rule.
Right. That's
So
right.
now the yellow vests bring a sense of unity, meeting each other, trying to find out a common ground for what they expect from their lives.
Yeah. Now your entry into politics, how did that start? How did it happen? Your first presidential campaign or your first political campaign?
Oh, it was in 1995, and we in France, if you get 500 signatures of mayors, you can't be a candidate, even if you don't have money.
Right.
In a presidential election, the state pays the voting, the voting, how you say that, voting ballots.
Yes.
They pay for the declarations of candidacies, and they paid also for the posters in precise places, not in all places.
Mm-hmm.
So we saw, why don't run? We have something to say. All the political parties are failing. It was in 1995. They don't see the financial crisis that's coming. So what I said in 1995, as LaRouche said it in the United States, in 10 to 12 years, we'll have a big financial crisis if we continue like that. It's not, we are not doomed to that, but something has to be done.
So you were working with the Schiller Institute or the LaRouche PAC?
No. We were in France with a team of about 20 people. At the time, when we started, LaRouche was in jail.
Right.
And we said, we have to do something. We have to support him internationally. We had let's say, 1, 2, 3 meetings in Paris, international meetings, with top people from the resistance layers, from the all left who supported LaRouche and said, this guy has to be freed.
And just for the listeners or viewers who don't know, Lyndon LaRouche was jailed in 1998 by prosecution. Robert Mueller, the same one with who's been prosecuting Donald Trump for the past 2 years with this fake Russiagate, and it was a totally politically motivated prosecution, and with so many of the same characteristics and marks that we saw.
It doesn't mean that Trump is like LaRouche. He's not at the same level, but it means that Trump represents a challenge like LaRouche represented to the British Empire.
Yeah.
Why? Because he doesn't come, and even some people are saying it now in France, he doesn't come from the established channels of power in the United States. He comes from somewhere else. So it represents for the British Empire a danger because they don't know how to control it.
Although lately it seems like Trump has fallen in line, arresting Assange, doing this fake coup in Venezuela. I'm very sad to say.
He should get rid of Pompeo. He should get rid of Bolton.
Yes.
He should get rid of Elliot Abrams. If he doesn't do it, something is going to happen with him. And besides, you have a financial crash coming. And Trump has always said, I made my career Wall Street. Look, Wall Street increased by 30 or 35%, and this means that the economy is good. One day, he can be
wiped out
by a crash. And the crash could be organized by his enemies. So
that's right.
I warned him against that. And he should side with, let's say, the forgotten majority, the basis for in the United States, where you can organize together Puerto Ricans, Hispanics, blacks, whites, and all these people on the basis of social a social commitment to a better future.
Yeah, and which I think was his campaign. I think he's gone off his campaign.
And it's Make America Great Again. It's not the Republican Party. People don't understand that.
That's right. He was anti-Republican.
But for that, against the country club politics. But for that, he has himself a country club. That's his.
That's right. That's right.
But he should work against his people that are surrounding him. It's the most difficult thing in all lives. De Gaulle had the same problem. He was surrounded by people who either did not understand him, or in 1969, when he tried to bring about this issue of the participation, he was betrayed by his own friends.
So, I mean, de Gaulle's fall in 69 was very much tied to the
referendum. He got a no in the referendum. 52% of the votes were no, and he left. Yeah. He was not compelled to leave, but he left because I can only be in power if I'm supported by the French people on a decisive issue.
Right, right.
All the others stayed. They lost referendum. Chirac lost referendum. He stayed.
Right.
All of them.
But now I want to get back to when you started your own presidential campaign, and you said you got 500 signatures of mayors. That's an impressive feat. I mean,
it was easy at the time because nobody was democratic enough to go after them and ask, except an extreme left-wing movement called Lutte Ouvrière, which is an old Trotskyite movement.
Okay.
Except them, nobody had done it. So we did it, and we got the signatures, and then the storm fell on us because we were not supposed to be there, and we had to be either this or that, Saddam Hussein agents, KGB, CIA, anything.
Did any of the mayors who signed, the 500 mayors, did they disavow and withdraw their support?
Yes, well, they sent journalists, like they did in the United States. They sent journalists to each mayor, to most of the mayors, to say, why have you signed for a guy who is extreme right-wing, extreme left, or whatever, who is insane, who is saying things that doesn't belong to our politics and our world. He's shaking things, it's very dangerous. You should never have supported him. So some stayed, others decided to go underground to make us to be ostriches, to
ostracize,
to the sand. But others stayed, and now we have a movement of mayors who it's difficult for them to be active in politics because the mayors are supposed to rule over communes, over districts.
Okay. So the mayor positions in France are not political?
Most of them are not. They are political, but they, for example, in the municipal council, there are people from different, it's like the Gilet Jaunes, from people from different political ideas, but committed to serve the district.
Okay.
And the mayors, they say, if we go with a person like Cheminade, it's difficult to maintain inside the municipal council a sense of community. So you have that. Also, you have that it's a country where things are very, let's say, defined in legal terms.
Yeah.
So a person which is, as they say in France, out of the nails, you have these nails so-called in the streets to cross roads.
Right,
Of the, how you call that, there, where you cross the street.
Yeah, a crosswalk.
Yes, in crosswalk. You go out of the crosswalks, then it's very difficult in France because if something happens, it will again be the big fight against the Republicans and the imperialists. And it will be a tremendous fight, and people are afraid that this fight will take place. Yeah. Now it's taking place because you can't avoid it anymore. That's so right. I think, in a sense, it's a moment of history, maybe not for me, but for our ideas and for our people.
Right. Yeah. So you had your campaign. You didn't get a lot of the vote, but I could appreciate that. I have campaigned myself and
yes, I know.
Not gotten a lot of vote. not gotten a lot of vote. Once because I did get, I almost got.
There was a book written by a French writer. She's a lefty of some sorts, but she's a honest woman, called Julia Cagé. and she wrote a book called The Price of Democracy. And she says, I checked all the elections, and people that won were always the people that spent the more money and had the more money given to them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is becoming clear for the people. Even a book on that has this book, and people read it. It had a certain success. So you have this. It's how we call it, a suffrage censitaire. Like in the past, under Louis Philippe, for example, in the 19th century in France, you could only vote if you had a certain level of revenue, of income.
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm. You had income qualifications for voting.
De facto, you have that. So that's what the Gilets Jaunes are against. And at the same time, it creates, let's say, small earthquakes in all political parties, in the extreme left, in the extreme right, and it creates a situation where there is a sense of openness in French politics that it was never before since '68.
Yeah, it's incredible, and I mean, and even the things like I just saw that there's an organization formed by all the people who've been injured by the police, who've lost eyes, who've lost limbs.
The meeting the day before yesterday.
Yes, I mean the brutality that's going on. I mean, had this been Venezuela or Russia, or the whole world would be coming down and calling for regime change. Or had it been Syria happening in?
Yeah, sure. And
it's incredible. It's going on for months and months. Yes.
The word, I have to remember even the word, because the word is so ridiculous. It's not called flashballs. It's called lanceurs de balles de défense, which is instruments to throw defense balls. It's not defense balls.
Not flashballs.
It's classified internationally as a belligerent weapon.
Yeah, and I understand the Human Rights Commission in France recommended that it not be used.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
But they're still using it.
Yes.
And there are these grenados, these lacrimogenous gases grenados, and these exploding grenados.
Yeah.
So people lost hands with these grenados, and they lost the eyes with the flashballs. And it's incredible because it's injured. There were about 1,500 people or more, badly injured, and very, very badly injured, more than 100, with 25 having lost their eyes.
And most of the people of the world have no idea about this. This is incredible. This is happening in France, one of the G7 countries, one of the leading.
But nobody had an idea that existed in the presidential election, not a word. So in France, there is a discussion on that, but it has not to spread into other countries. And what you have in France, you look at it, is the absolute domination by the Anglo-American channels of information. People are protesting, or the newspapers, the establishment newspapers are protesting against Putin, the influence of Russia, and so on and so forth. But in France, it's the same as in the United States. They point the finger at Putin to prevent to see the British influence.
That's right.
The American networks. Clear. And that's why Lin's exoneration is so important. Lin Dotlarouche exoneration is so important. Because he was the first one in the United States who denounced clearly the British Empire, and it's not something historical, it's here and now with worse methods.
Yeah, it's a global financial system, basically.
Global financial system.
What he refers to as the British Empire
is culture, and a culture, a counterculture.
That's right.
Because they created this Congress for Cultural Freedom, and a very interesting thing that it's not known. Even in our organization, sometimes we don't look at it. The Congress for Cultural Freedom was based to disrupt the European left. But in the United States, it was a Committee for Cultural Freedom to disrupt the American right. So the same people were doing the jobs on the two sides to prevent something to happen on both sides of the aisle, as they are saying in the United States, of the aisle.
Who was part of this Committee for Cultural Freedom?
Oh, it was all these people. Nabokov was the brother of Nabokov, the writer, was one of them. There was Raymond Aron in France. There were people, diverse people who were Swiss. They were British. A lot of people associated with it. And in the United States, somebody like Frank Wisner, for example,
Okay.
was acquainted later, his son was acquainted with Nicolas Sarkozy. So you have all these people around who created a culture which was no more based on the moral improvement of human beings, but on impulse, on flashes, on a creation disconnected from the moral issue. And this was, let's say, supposed to be against the Soviet art.
Right.
In fact, it was against the populations and against the capacity of the population to develop their creative powers.
Right.
Soviet art, of course, was no good, but it was an excuse to create a situation where this empire would revive with other means after World War II. Because, this discussion between Churchill and Roosevelt, reported by Roosevelt's son, when Roosevelt said, I did not fight this war to reestablish a British Empire, an empire. And Churchill said, we want to keep our empire because it's our identity.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I interviewed Liliana Guarini from Italy, who's also involved with the LaRouche movement, in the Italian arm of it. And she was telling her story of how she started as a student in the hippie movement.
Yes.
And when she went to the LaRouche movement, she heard LaRouche saying that Dylan is a CIA agent, and these things were shocking to her. But then she understood through LaRouche the power of classical culture, classical music, and these things, and it also reconciled her with her parents. Very interesting.
But from a different or not so different background, it's about the same with me.
Yeah. Okay. You mean in terms of the cultural critique, or your parents? What do you?
No, not the parents. About culture.
Yes.
Recognizing the necessity for a culture of discovery and creation, the necessity for that, when the '68 movement was falling into a culture of
nihilism, pleasure, libertinism,
and something which if you look at it, happened in Germany, in the Weimar Republic, and you see how it led to what it led.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, and that link you make with de Gaulle and the gold and the dollar, that's fascinating. I never made that link before, and I'm definitely going to.
A few people make this link. You are not the only ones You are not the only one to have not make it.
Yeah. It's a very, very important link.
I was at the School of Public Administration, and all of a sudden we saw arriving a student, sociological student, interviewing half of the people there to know how they saw the '68 movement, making a profile. So we cornered him and said, for who you are working? He said, for the University of Southern California. So your report will be given to whom? And he had to say to the CIA.
Right. Yeah.
So it's clear.
Yeah. Very interesting. So, let's be kind of clear. Let's say about Gilet Jaunes. If we come back to the Gilet Jaunes movement, in terms of its implication for France, for Europe, and maybe even beyond, what do you see? Where do you see this going? How do you see it ending?
If we manage to connect the citizens' initiative referendum with a demand for a national bank, it would lead to a change in all the perspective, not only in Europe. It will be, I don't think we can make it in a very short period of time, but it's making its way into the movement. And our members, our friends who are Gilets Jaunes, go out with an immense cartoon bank saying national bank and giving the money to the people. On the other side, there is a central bank giving the money to the wealthy people and to the people that are involved in this looting.
That's right.
What I call one world looting, one world financial. it's not that globalization is not the problem. The problem is that the globalization is financial and controlled by financial interests.
Yeah.
We have to change and to have nation states working together to define a future. So we are involved in trying to organize also sovereignist movements who what they don't understand is the main issues of culture and the main issue, financial issue. Some understand, and these people are precious because they are themselves talking around about it. Yeah. So we have people from different backgrounds who are around us at this point who are interested by that. There is a sense of change in the country, and at the same time, let's say, a sense that these European elections lead to nowhere. There is a lack of interest, an absolute lack of interest for the European elections. For example, the 12 candidates, the 12 heads of lists in the European election were involved in a meeting, in a discussion of 3 hours. 12 candidates discussing with 3 hours with 12 journalists is already quite bad because confusion. It's a talk show. So only 1,300,000 people listened or saw the debate, which is 5 times less than the usual political debate.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Would Macron? Do you think Macron would leave because of this? It doesn't look like it at all. I mean,
but Macron would get about 22, 23, and probably Marine Le Pen would get about the same, even a bit more.
Yeah.
So the collapse is a collapse of Die Linke, or the French extreme left, who is falling to 9%.
Yeah.
The ecologists are at 9%. And then the rest is a mixed bag, except that the right-wingers, who were at 8-9%, they presented a very, let's say, a very decent person which hides their ideas who are not so decent, the liberal right wing, and he's getting 14%. Right. But all this is in a state of total chaos and confusion, and people see the reality is not there.
Yeah.
The reality is what's happening in the roots of society.
Yeah. Well, to kind of sum up as we conclude our discussion, what would you say is the main message that you want to put out to the world? I mean, you've been doing this a long time. You've been having a lot of campaigns. You've been involved in many things, but as a sort of main message that you want to give out, what would it be?
People should be allowed to be given a sense of what's good in the world history, and let's say the efforts that we have been doing, and others too, to change the present situation, which started after World War II, but became worse and worse after 68, 69. So we need another world. And the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche is part of that, because it's not only to give justice to a person that was so unjustly and unfairly treated, but it's his ideas that should be freed, in fact, and exonerated, so that people could really look at them, discuss them, said whether they agree, whether they disagree, but have an access to them, because it has represented in world history, in the history of the 20th century, an incredibly active element. I was looking into it now, and I had even myself forgotten certain moments with Lopez Portillo, with Indira Gandhi, with Fred Wills from Guyana, who was leading in 1976 the movement of the
New International Economic Order
countries in Colombo. So who called for international development banks to replace the prevailing institutions, the IMF and the World Bank. So we have all this history, and also we were looking with his wife at a video that he gave this was in 1998, saying that the future is going to be defined by the United States and China. And these two countries, the others should play also a leading role, but the United States and China are going to be key. And the first time I heard him is when he discussed that the crisis of the world financial system was going to happen, and it happened in 1981. So we have to show to people, this is what we would like, to show the people the real history of the 20th century, the real history of Europe and Asia, and the real history of Iberoamerica, the real history of the whole world, of all the Middle East, and to put that as a treasure in the hands so that the best of all cultures should join to make the world which is going to come better, and not only better, but capable to support itself, to reestablish the principle of the right to a true good life for the future. And in that, my fight for the exoneration of Indre La Rouge, and at the same time, our fight here in France and in Europe generally, is a one. And this is the sense that I want to give to people that are
Right.
now, the sense that the future should define what we are doing now and here.
Exactly. Now, in reflecting back on your long journey through this, all the ups and downs and your struggles, is there anything that you would have done differently, you think, or?
No, I am very happy today, surrounded by young people who are committed for a better future and fight with a lot of courage for it here in France. There are a few, but they are so committed that it creates, like when you put a stone in the water and it creates circles who are broadening and broadening. This is what we're doing. But if I miss something, is that to have not enough time to listen to classical music and to write poetry. This is what I did in my past life. So now,
in French or in Spanish?
I wrote in both languages. And they are different. They are the same and different at the same time.
That's right. That's right. It's a different mentality you have to get into.
Yes, I wrote one on the hornero. I don't know if you know. It's this bird of Argentina who make a big nest out of mud. Okay. And it was how this hornero is at the same time a good father and a very insolent human being.
Excellent. Now, one thing I like to talk about with my guests is because you've experienced so much, that there's been a lot of times in your life, I'm sure, where the pressures would have been quite intense, where you would have taken a lot of risks, where you would have faced dangers, but you would have found the strength in yourself to go forward, to go through the tragedies, to face the challenges. What has given you that personal strength to do so?
I think it's always difficult to say, but I can remember one day we were going from, I was 5 years old. We were going from Argentina to France, and we were in an old ship at the time. All the ships were 6 or 7 in the same little room, and there were people arriving to some place, and there was a smell. So I know it was us. The boat was going slowly, and there were people on board doing something. And I asked my father, "Take me in your arms. I want to know what they are doing." And all these gentlemen were throwing pieces of money to little African boys who were diving to get the piece of money. So one of these guys told me, "Get this piece of money and throw it." So I jumped out of the arms of my father and threw the piece of money on the ground. I said, "I will not do it." So I don't know why I said that. I think that something in the family, something that I heard, something that was around, it's very difficult to say, but it's something inspired, I think, deeply by, I don't like the word roots. People are speaking about Christian roots, Republican roots. I'm speaking of sources, Christian and Republican sources. And these sources, if they are really Christian and Republican sources, are open to all human beings. And this is, I think, what has determined me in moments where I face some dangers, but let's not exaggerate. There are people in their lives who faced much more dangers than me, including Emmanuel Macron during these 5 years, and including all my friends from the resistance movement in France, who every day were risking their lives for the sake of liberty, equality, and fraternity.
Mm-hmm. What would you recommend to a young person listening to this podcast now?
Lynn said, have fun. Lynn LaRue said, have fun. To have fun in discovering, and not reaching immediate conclusions, but doing things to test if the discoveries are true or not. And to test yourselves, not to be afraid by people that lie or that people who said stupid things. Don't be afraid. Do what you have to do, and it should be always for things that you feel creative and for the advantage of the other. Always for the advantage of the other, not for your own advantage.
Great.
Aspiration.
Excellent. Well, can you tell us about your plans for the next 5 years or so? Or the next year? Or what do you have?
To get older. No, to get younger. To get younger, fighting with young people and reading things. I can't imagine how people could live without discovering new things, even at my age, and even further, because it's such a pleasure to discover how this world is rich, funny, and interesting, and how it's interesting to see and moving to see that there are human beings in this whole world who are so committed to try to make a world better, and to be involved with them, whatever what they are, is always a pleasure, because I think that always, I mentioned in a recent memorial for Lynn that beauty is truth and truth is beauty, as John Keats said. And the thing of beauty is a joy forever. So to be involved in beauty, and if you are involved in beauty, when you have to face a big danger or a big challenge, you can reach a level of the sublime because this sense of beauty has inspired you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I want to thank you so much, not only for this interview, but for all the work you've been doing over the years. You know, I admire your hard work, your dedication, your determination, and I look forward to your every success and to see your work bear fruit now and also in the future. So
there is only one problem: I should do more.
Well, that's all for Independent Thought and Freedom this week. Please join us again next week. And in the meanwhile, make sure you subscribe, leave me a rating, like and share this podcast with your friends. Thanks, and bye for now.